All right, so we've got the foundation laid that now we can start moving into probably the kinds of things that you start to think of when you think about algebra class. And the first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at expressions and how to simplify expressions. That's going to be our first unit. We're actually going to spend several weeks working through different types of expression and the different ways that you simplify them. So in this video, we're going to begin with the very basics. So here's our learning objectives for this video. Simply know what an expression is, and specifically be able to talk about how it's similar and different from equations and inequalities. Remember, in our class, pretty much always, you just need to have a working definition. In other words, you don't need to be able to word for word tell me what an expression is, but you need to be able to recognize it when you see it. Okay, so know what an expression is. Know what kinds of things you're allowed to do to an expression and what you cannot do. It actually turns out that there's a lot of restrictions on expressions. And so we're going to talk about that. And then be able to simplify expressions. Now, like I said, this third one, we're going to spend several weeks working on this third one. So in this video, I'm really going to focus on learning objective number 1 and 2. I'll put another video together here in just a minute that has some very simple expressions that you should be able to simplify already. And then over the course of the next several weeks, we'll move on into more difficult expressions. Okay, so let's start with what an expression is. And remember, you just need to have a working definition. And so I'm not going to give you something that's formal, Mathenese dictionary kind of thing. Very simply, an expression is something that has some kind of combination of numbers, operators, and variables. Okay, now realize it does not need to have all of those things, but it's going to have some mixture of them. So it might have some numbers that are being added together. So that would be numbers and operators. It might have some variables with exponents. So that would be variables and operators. It might have some numbers and variables. Okay, so it could be any sort of combination of those things. So that's what it does have. That's what it does have. An expression does not have, it does not have an equal sign. That's an equation. As soon as you put in an equal sign, that's an equation. And it also does not have inequality arrows, inequality signs. So remember, the arrows that we use with inequalities are like greater than, less than, greater than, equal to. Expressions don't have those things. So some examples of expressions. Examples of expressions. You might have 2 plus x. That's an expression. It has a number, it has a variable, it has an operator. Okay. You might have 3x minus 5. Okay. Multiple numbers, multiple operators, and a variable. You could have x plus y squared. Okay. That's an expression. It's a more complicated expression for sure, but that's an expression. Okay. Some counter examples. If I have 3x minus 4 equals 2, now that's an equation. That's not an expression, okay? If I have 6x equals y, that's an equation. That's not an expression. If I have 2x plus 3 is less than or equal to 7, that's an inequality. That's not an expression, okay? So that's our first learning objective. Be able to recognize something that is an expression as opposed to things that are not expressions. That's our first learning objective. Okay, so there we go. Our second learning objective, what can you do and what can you not do with an expression? Well, it turns out expressions are very limited, okay? So the only things that you can do to expressions are things that result in its value not changing. Things that don't change the value. Now that's a little bit nebulous because once we throw in variables, we're not sure what the value is. But remember from our previous lesson, variables just represent numbers. So if we know that the activity that we're doing would not change the value with numbers, then it also won't change the value with variables, and that's okay. So let's start with some things that we know how to do with numbers. For example, if I have the expression 12 over 16, remember a fraction means divide. That's what a fraction means. So this is two numbers with an operator. So that's an expression, 12 over 16. Well, I know that something that I could do if I wanted is I could divide the top and the bottom both by 4. And normally we wouldn't show that work, but for right now, just so it's clear, I'm going to show that work. And we end up with 3 over 4 when we do that, okay? So these two things are two different expressions. They look different. There's a 12, this has a 3, this has a 16, this has a 4. But both of them have the same value. They're both equal to 0.75, okay? They both represent this concept of 3/4. They have the same value. That's an example of simplifying. And so when we talk about simplifying, that's okay to do. It never changes the expression's value. That's okay. Okay, here's something else that doesn't ever change the expression's value. We could multiply it by 1. If we multiply something by 1, that doesn't change its value. Now you might think to yourself, well, why would I ever multiply it by 1? Well, actually, that's the way we do a lot of our work with fractions. For example, right here, to go from 12 to 16, when I'm dividing both by 4, well, 4 over 4 is the same as 1. So I'm really just dividing by 1. If I had two fractions that I was going to add together, we know that in order to add fractions together, you need a common denominator. Well, how would I get a common denominator? I'd multiply this by 2 over 2. 2 over 2 is the same as 1. So I'm actually just simply multiplying by 1. I'm just writing the 1 in a unique way so that I get the kind of answer I want. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that you are allowed to do, is you're allowed to multiply by 1. That's okay to do. By the same token, you're also allowed to add by 0. And there'll be a time later in our class where we will do that, but we'll write the 0 in a funky sort of way, just like we're writing this 1 in a funky sort of way. But these are things you're allowed to do. You're allowed to simplify, you're allowed to multiply by 1. And then there's only one other thing you're allowed to do. You're allowed to do something that's called expand. You're allowed to expand. So here's an example of expanding. Let's say that I have something like, well, if I had 12, just the number 12. I know that's kind of a very, very simple expression. It's just one number. But do you agree with me that 12 has the same value as what 3 times 4 has? Those are equal to each other. I haven't changed the value, but I've taken the way that it started and I've written it in a different way by expanding it out into multiple parts. So expanding is kind of like the opposite of simplifying. If I had 3 times 4 and I simplified it, I would get 12. But it's also okay to start with a number like 12 and expand it out into something like 3 times 4. This particular example is called factoring. And we actually will spend many weeks learning about how to factor, okay? So there's only 3 things that we can do with an expression. We can simplify it. That's what we'll spend the most time at the beginning of our class doing. We can multiply by 1 or we can add by 0. That's something that we will do only rarely and on occasion, and only when we're trying to do something like this where making the number look different is helpful. So this is more rare. And if you're a little confused about when or why you would do that, you'll see lots of examples when we get to this. Like I said, right now we're going to focus on simplifying. Coming soon, we will talk about expanding, because that also has a useful purpose that we'll see later in our class, not so much here at the beginning. Okay, so we've covered the basic objectives, the first 2 objectives. Recognize an expression when you see it, It's something that does not have an equal sign or an inequality sign. And then know what you can do. You can expand it, you can simplify it, and you can multiply by 1. And know what you cannot do. Well, you simply cannot do anything else. All right. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to make another video in just a minute where we simplify some basic expressions. So if you want to see some examples of how this first piece works right here, then be sure to watch the next video. Thanks for watching this one. I will see you later.